Hello and welcome to this unit on Buddhism for religious and cultural classics. I hope that by the end of this particular unit, you will have had the opportunity to interact with the life of Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, and that you would also have an opportunity to interact with some of his teachings, with some of the writings, in other words, that have been passed down through his Sangha, the monastic group and community, and everything that has transpired since then. Of course, just like we would hope to understand when people think of Christianity, that there is a variety of different forms of Christianity, and the same could be applied to any of the other religions that we look at. Buddhism is no different. What comes to mind to you when you think of Buddhism? For me, what comes to mind is my experience when I went all the way back in, I believe it was 2005, my first time experiencing a majority Buddhist culture in Myanmar. This is in Yangon right here. That is the Shwedagon Pagoda, made almost entirely of gold, and that was a phenomenal experience, as I got to even share the good news of Jesus with a lot of people who are Buddhist. And so this is what comes to mind for me. What about you? What comes to mind for you when you think of Buddhism? God gave me the privilege and the opportunity to lead a Buddhist man to faith in Christ. There was a businessman who was living in Malaysia, and he had a friend that he wanted me to meet and to have conversations with. And over Hokkien mee noodles at a food stall, me, the Christian businessman, and this guy, we sat down and we talked for a few hours. And by the end of that night, he had professed faith in Christ, and we even baptized him, I think it was 2 weeks later. So those are some of my experiences. Maybe some of you have had some experiences within Buddhism in a very surface level type of way. I want to introduce you to some aspects of Buddhism, and then of course point us to the life of Buddha and his teachings. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, as we need to remind ourselves, just like it was with Hinduism, there is a point of origin as it relates to all other religions for Buddhism. And you can see the spread right here from the 500s of BC all the way until the 600s AD. And it centers around this historical figure, the Buddha. There is debate. Is this person just merely a legend, or is there an actual historical Buddha? Although it has no grounds whatsoever, I'm sure there are other people, liberal perspectives, that would like to debate the reality of whether or not Jesus actually existed in the flesh on this earth. So that makes sense, even though there are really illegitimate claims about that, because the evidence is overwhelming that it's shown otherwise. That can happen here as well on the nature of the historical Buddha. But what you're seeing right here is a picture, or at least a map of sorts, that shows the way in which it spread during this particular time. So Buddhism and its Hindu South Asian origins. Simply put, you need to know that Buddhism is from South Asia as a religious movement, and that it originated through these wandering monks. So if you recall, within Hinduism, the Upanishads, you had the era of the Vedas, and from the Vedas they produced the Upanishads, these thoughts, these philosophical thoughts about things that were emerging within, I guess, the Hindu perspective, the Hinduism-like perspective. As it got into this era of the Upanishads, the sages, the people of that era, started to debate things, started to think and discuss things about, like you see the topics right here, the nature of Atman and Brahman. This is when the Buddha, Siddhartha, was born in this particular context. It was birthed, Buddhism was birthed out of a specific person. This historical Buddha was the product of the cultural and religious world of Hinduism and his response to it. So, in the 6th century BCE, the Upanishadic texts were challenging the control of the Brahmins. Do you remember that term, the Brahmins? This is the upper class in the caste system within Hinduism. You remember the Aryan influence upon the non-Aryan peoples, Sanskrit, the religion, the technology, everything that was emerging within the South Asian world at this particular time, and the emergence of the caste system and the role that the upper part of the caste played within the society. Brahmins, there were discussions and debates, in fact a full-on rejection from many with regard to this caste system. And in addition to that, discussions about, as you see here, sacrificial rites, additional questions regarding liberation, you know, their approach, their thought or concepts of nirvana, meditation, asceticism, on and on the list goes. So this was the context where Buddhism was birthed. So what about the Buddha? You can see these statues or these pictures, a variety of different ways of portraying who the Buddha was. Got to remember that it's a bit of a way in which you can kind of hear that term Buddha, and it refers to, yes, that maybe that first type of Buddha that we're thinking of right now, Siddhartha Gautama, but also there are others in a way that term can be used because it's related to those who are awakened, those who have attained nirvana. So yes, there's that one, that maybe that original one, even though it probably may have been others according to the Buddhist worldview, but additionally there could be others too. So let's take a look at this real quick. Siddhartha Gautama, I'm in my office and I can actually look over there and see a pictorial biography of a book of the life of Siddhartha Gautama that someone, actually a Buddhist, gave to me probably about 20 years ago. And you can get a variety of different ways in which this story, the history of the Buddha, is explained. You know, for us as Christians, we've got the Gospels, in particular Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that help us to really have consensus and an understanding of who Jesus was, especially as he lived on this earth. That's been challenging for me to really find consensus with regard to this. So there is a general consensus about who this person is, but in terms of going straight to like this particular historical document, for me at least, I found it to be challenging. So some of the things that have been generally agreed upon: born in the Gautama family of the Shakya clan, in the foothills of the Himalayas for this particular time, raised in the Kshatriya caste, that warrior caste, and so in essence had everything noble, and that's agreed upon, and in the story that you're often drawn to with regard to the story of Siddhartha Gautama, has everything and then denounces it all and renounces his governing birthright, and he joins a bit of a aesthetic kind of way of life around at that particular age of 29. So he dabbles in two sides. He dabbles in the realms of self-mortification, like just denying of self, right? But then also sensual indulgence, bleeding back into his previous existence, his previous life. And this is what you might hear of a term, a phrase. It's called the middle way. And so this is something that's pivotal to the teachings of the Buddha, and this is his pathway for the attaining of nirvana, of enlightenment, at this age, at age 35. I'm happy to give you my resource, my source where I'm getting this information, if any of you would like to request it, focused on especially one particular book related to world religions. And so he becomes known as the Buddha, the Awakened One, and he's also referred to as the Shakyamuni Buddha. I struggle with that one, but that, as you can see, take a look at it right here. It's just reflective of the clan that he comes from, and the Gautama Buddha. So he spends the next 45 years wandering around, and he forms this monastic organization because it's the let's take a look. Why am I blanking on that? Hold on. It is the Shramana is right here, those wandering monks. And so it's in that spirit that he has another monastic movement of sorts called the Sangha. All right, so that's what's taking place. After his death, as is like most, where there is a large following, that there's going to be dispute about what happens next, and maybe with regard, like you're seeing on the screen, the nature of his teachings. So some people within this community were more lax, others wanted more disciplinary rigor, and as a result, there were some councils that showed up. And so these monks, oftentimes referred to as arhats, and that's something within one particular vein of Buddhism, they still use that. They get together, recite his teachings, and they start to see these things develop and emerge, these pitikas, right? So there's two of them that show up, they're baskets, and then a third one shows up as well, which is related to philosophical arguments. And these three pitikas are known as the Tripitikas, and these are almost universally canonical for Buddhists. What am I meaning by all this? When you hear these terms, Pitikas and the Tripitaka, these are terms that you can think of and you go, okay, so these might be sacred types of texts that are generally revered by most Buddhists. These are writings, these are philosophies, these are explanations of the way in which monks are to conduct themselves and things like that. Monastic discipline, as you can see with the second one. So that's what's happening there. You can see this, the councils that emerged during this time. And there's one person I want to bring to your attention, and that's Emperor Ashoka. The only reason for this is because now this guy in particular, who ends up through his world, devotes himself to the teaching of Buddhism, starts to send out missionaries. In other words, he starts to send out ambassadors, people who are, advocates for this particular thought, this religious way of life, and this is how Buddhism starts to spread, as you saw on that initial map. And so there's these stupas that end up showing up, and it's giving now visual representation of this religion, and this starts to show up, and very important for the spread of Buddhism within the Buddhist life. This is important for you to see right here. I know it's blocked a little bit, but there really are two main branches of Buddhism. So you've got the Theravada, also known as the Doctrine of the Elders type of Buddhism, and then you have Mahayana. So I've helped you to see right here that they can be, in some kind of ways, divided geographically. So on the left side, Theravada, you have mainland Southeast Asia, Sri Lanka, but on the other side, you have East Asia. So Mahayana, if you think of Chinese Buddhism. So for me, the way I try to think about this is, in some cases where I've observed, maybe because it's something through television, online, or something like that, you can see quite a number of Buddhist monks out and about in the community. But then in others, you see that that's not as prevalent. I think what I'm trying to teach you here is that sometimes what you're observing within the different cultures, there is some Buddhist temples here within the city of New Orleans. You can notice certain things, and like we hope that we wouldn't allow others to say, well, all forms of Christianity are basically the same. No, there's great distinction. There can also be some pretty significant distinction, especially within these two main branches of Buddhism. I am providing for you some additional YouTube videos. One of those YouTube videos does a great job trying to explain the differences between Theravada Buddhism and Mahayana Buddhism, as you can see some of the things that I've shared on this screen. All right, so the two major schools that we have right here, the thing that I want to bring up here is something that I've touched on just a little bit, this concept of the middle way. My advice to you is to Google that just a little bit, because that is something that Buddhists are trying to talk about between the kind of like this aesthetic way of life, the removal of all pleasures and things like that, and then the full-on indulgence of all things, right? They have all sorts of thoughts like the concept of absolute truth, or the way in which to achieve nirvana, things like that. And then yoga as well. Yoga is something that emerged within our discussions about Hinduism, and it's something as well, the practice of yoga, that shows up, of course, within Buddhism as well. All right. Buddhism kind of semi-returns back to India, its place of origin, because at first it really started to spread out east, and so you associate it with places like Sri Lanka, or any other aspects of Southeast Asia or East Asia, for example, China. But because of this particular form of Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, led by their spiritual leader, the Dalai Lama, that it also has seen a bit of an emergence back into India. So there's a spread of Buddhism that takes place, as you can see, south, north, and to the east, and of course in Tibet as well. So what is this one, though? Have you ever heard of this before? The Buddha Charita. Have you ever heard of that? Charita, I can see that word, and for me, living in Malaysia, learning the language, I kind of have an assumption of what that might mean. I think it's related to the story. What is the main storylines for the life of the Buddha? This really helps you to summarize this. That's the Buddha Charita, right? You see the different aspects that are, for the most part, celebrated within all versions of Buddhism. So the fact that he was born to Indian royalty, raised in luxury, he goes through these 4 passing sights. And that'll be crucial when you read a little bit for yourself about the story of the Buddha. The great going forth, the denial of self, and that middle way that starts to emerge, and then sitting under a tree and attaining enlightenment. And so that's kind of what happens. What about those sights? In his journey, he sees someone who's sick, who's old, who's dead, and a holy man. And these particular sights, one who's been just surrounded by pleasure and royalty and everything like that, sees these things and puts him on a path towards trying to seek enlightenment. And so you can see some of the aspects of the life of the historical Buddha. So this one really helps us to see what I was trying to describe with regard to Buddhism and the middle way. The Buddha taught the middle way, which is between luxury and self-denial, right? That's the fundamental essence right there of this middle way teaching. So you can see this picture that depicts him and his moment of achieving enlightenment under this tree, right? And this is the historical spot in India that they say is where it took place, allegedly. All right, so let's move on from some of these things right here into this discussion of just simply the 4 noble truths. So this is part of the Buddhist teachings. Let me just help us to take a look at this by reading it for us. First of all, it's related to sorrow and suffering, that all living sentient beings experience suffering, a condition rooted in the physical realities of old age, sickness, and death, and in emotional feelings of sadness and despondency. Then you also have the origin and the cause of sorrow and suffering. The major cause of dukkha is the insatiable craving, desire, or thirst for sensual gratification. Because of the impermanent and transient nature of the world, our sensual gratifications pass, and we find ourselves once again in the grip of craving. Then what about the cessation or the end of suffering? So you can see it's all centered around this theme of suffering, which is really kind of fascinating if you think about it, because from a Christ-centered perspective, you can see how many ways we can definitely relate and show the supremacy of Christ with regard to the teachings of the Buddha. So this third one right here, the cessation, the ending of suffering, means the ending of our dukkha is by ending the craving that causes it. This ending of craving, which is an ending of the condition of ignorance at its root, is described as nirvana. And then fourth and finally, the path. right? This is often called then the Noble Eightfold Path. So we have the Four Noble Truths. That's something you should be familiar with, all centered around suffering. And then we have this path, this Noble Eightfold Path. That they're quite popular terms within Buddhism. And it is prescribed in Buddhism as a means of attaining the goal of nirvana, consisting of 8 aspects of dimensions of life that need to be cultivated. So I think I have that up for us right here, a summary of the Four Noble Truths: the truth of suffering, the truth of the cause of suffering, the truth of the end of suffering, and then the truth of the path leading to the end of suffering. So what about the Noble Eightfold Path? Well, right here you can see it in this wheel, and you can see beginning at the top and working our way clockwise: right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right concentration, right mindfulness. So what about these? I'm always nervous to move my picture over here just because it makes the video crash at times. So number 1, right worldview and right understanding. And that's developing the philosophical perspective that enables one to penetrate through one's deluded conceptions of reality. That's the Noble Eightfold Path, number 1. I'm showing you this at a very introductory level. I want you to investigate this further this week, all right? Number 2, right intention or commitment. Developing a sincere commitment to embark on the path to liberation with determination and diligence. Number 3, right speech, right communication. Using language and communication for the transmission of truth and refraining from speech that adds to the suffering of the world. Number 4, right action. Following the 5 precepts. We need to investigate that. What are the 5 precepts? Buddhism's moral code of not harming, not stealing, not lying, not avoiding intoxicants, and avoiding sexual misconducts, and putting into practice the actions that lead to the attainment of liberation. Number 5, right livelihood. Doing work that is not injurious to the other sentient beings and is conducive to the attainment of liberation. Number 6, right effort. Persevering in the development of one's consciousness, that it is free from craving. Number 7, right mindfulness. Practicing meditative awareness so that the processes through which thoughts and feelings, the attendant cravings, and ego constructing activities may be discerned with clarity. And then 8, right contemplative absorption. Developing through the deepening of mindfulness a focused state of consciousness akin to deep concentration, in which both tranquility and penetrating insight may be obtained. Okay, all right, what's going on here? There is as we go back, just take a look real quick. Let me go backwards. We have the 4 Noble Truths. In other words, guided teachings, truth claims from a Buddhist perspective on how to go about understanding all that exists and what is taking place. And then you see in this 4th one the discussion and the understanding of this path, right? This Noble Eightfold Path, and all of these right ways in which you are to conduct yourselves. We don't want to go into it too much, but you can definitely see bridges towards showing the supremacy of the gospel that is done in the works of the perfect one, who is the Lord Jesus Christ, and how we are recipients of his great work, and we receive it by grace through faith. And it's important for us to recognize that this is just another aspect of a works-based religion that really puts you into a futile, really discouraging path, not being able to attain these things. But Christ has attained it for us, and he's given us life abundant and life eternal. So here's some other things related to the Bodhisattva ideal, just some other stuff. There's within Buddhism 3 refuges, or the 3 jewels. In other words, they talk about that they take refuge in these things, and the Buddha, his teachings, in the Dharma, that's what I meant, then into his teachings, but then also in the Sangha and the community, the ways in which they kind of say, hey, look, this is what I agree to, and I consider myself to be a part of. And then here's these 5 precepts that were mentioned. Basic moral code for all of Buddhists. One of the things I've never done this before, I'm looking forward to actually doing this, is to consider having this as a point of discussion with anyone who considers themselves a devout Buddhist. For me to be able to say, hey, so I've learned from a class that, and from books, that there is such a thing as 5 precepts, like moral codes. Is that something, a bit of a 10 commandments kind of thing for you that's going on within your religious worldview? It says right here to refrain from taking life, to refrain from taking what is not given, stealing, to refrain from sexual intercourse, to refrain from lying, to refrain from intoxicating drinks. And so maybe that's a moral code just for the monks. And that's the questions. Guys, this is the thing that's so wonderful about this. When you start to talk about it, it can be all like the book related, it can be the lecture related aspects of this, but you need to be able to take from this, apply it to experience where you're truly experiencing and encountering people who adhere to this religion, and then come with an open mind to learn from them their aspects. I'm not talking about an open mind for them to change your perspectives, because we hold ourselves to the truths, the absolute truth of God's word, but an open mind to kind of learn a little bit better from somebody like me with regard to aspects of Buddhism. All right, and so we talked about the Sangha and just the role that the community of monks that they play within Buddhism. This is the end of the lecture for Buddhism, for religious and cultural classics. And what you now have is an opportunity through the other assignments within the unit to really investigate the life of the Buddha, and to make sure that you really understand the 4 noble truths and the eightfold path. All right, so God bless you. Looking forward to our time in other units.